You've felt it. The hollow shock when someone you trusted erases themselves from your life without a single word of warning. No fight, no explanation, only an empty space where they used to be. And in that silence, 1,000 questions echo. But what if that departure wasn't about you? What if, under the surface, they had been vanishing long before they left? Today, we go deeper, through the lens of Carl Jung, to uncover the psychology of people who disappear without explanation. Chapter 1. The Quiet Erosion. When someone vanishes without a farewell, the instinct is to call them cold, selfish, emotionally cruel. Yet Jung invites us to see a different story. Not every exit is an act of indifference. Sometimes it's the final tremor of a soul that has been fracturing in silence for years. Picture the psyche not as a solid structure, but as a deep lake. On the surface, things appear calm, even serene, but below, unseen currents stir, and sediment piles up layer by layer. Jung taught that what we suppress does not evaporate, it sinks into the unconscious, where it accumulates until its weight becomes unbearable. The person who stops replying might have been burying emotional debris for years. Disappointment they never voiced, hurt they swallowed to keep the peace, exhaustion from always being the understanding one. They didn't disappear in a day. They eroded slowly, like a shoreline worn away not by one giant wave, but by countless small tides. So ask yourself, when you've seen someone pull back, did you ever consider that you were witnessing not the start of their absence, but its final stage? Too often, the outside world sees only the withdrawal, the unreturned calls, the muted presence. It misses the long history of inner exhaustion that preceded it. Jung once noted that loneliness isn't about the absence of people, but about the inability to share what seems essential to oneself. A person can be surrounded by family, by partners, by friends, and still feel utterly alone if the truest parts of them are met with indifference or dismissal every time they speak. Over time, they learn it's safer to be quiet, safer to stop trying. That silence becomes a home they never wanted, but one that feels more honest than performing connection. To ground this, let me share a real-life pattern I've observed in therapeutic work. A client I'll call Elena had been in a 7-year relationship. On the surface, she was always calm, always supportive, the one everyone leaned on. But inwardly, she had felt unheard for years. Every time she tried to express a genuine need, her partner would downplay it, call her oversensitive, or simply change the topic. Elena stopped bringing things up. She didn't leave right then. She stayed, smiling, cooking dinner, playing the role. One day, a minor disagreement happened. Something as trivial as where to go on vacation, and Elena quietly packed a bag, left a note saying she needed space, and never came back. Her partner was blindsided. But in our sessions, it became clear. She hadn't left in that moment. She'd already been gone for years, her authentic self slowly receding into a place where no one could reach her. And here's where Jung's lens sharpens. What Elena carried wasn't just sadness. It was an accumulation of unspeakable things that the unconscious was holding. And when that weight hits a threshold, the psyche acts, often before the conscious mind fully realizes why. That threshold is what we'll explore next, in the anatomy of a silence that becomes a deliberate choice. Chapter 2. When silence becomes a strategy of self-preservation. You might think silence always signals the end of caring, But from a depth psychology perspective, silence can sometimes be the very structure someone builds to survive when words have lost their power. This isn't the silence of punishment, it's the silence of depletion. Picture a river that has been blocked. At first, the water pushes against the dam, seeking a way through. It still holds force, still wants to flow. But if the dam holds firm year after year, the river begins to slow, then stagnate, and eventually creates a different path, perhaps underground, invisible to the world above. A human being is no different. After repeatedly being shut down, trivialized, or invalidated, their inner river of expression doesn't vanish. It turns inward. They stop explaining not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that speaking only leads to more pain. At first they still tried. They crafted gentle words. They hoped for understanding. But when every attempt was met with dismissal, a quiet resignation took root. Have you ever caught yourself holding back your truth, not out of fear of conflict, but out of a bone-deep certainty that it won't matter anyway? That feeling, repeated enough, turns silence from a pause into a permanent condition. Jung wrote about the immense power of what he called the feeling-toned complex. Those emotional clusters that form when repeated experiences of being unseen or invalidated clump together in the unconscious. A person may consciously think, I'm just taking a break from explaining, but the unconscious has already built a fortress. And from that fortress, the only way to preserve any remnant of self-worth is to stop engaging altogether. So the disappearance isn't a rash act. It's the culmination of a long, weary process. I remember a colleague, Marcus. He was known for his patience, his ability to listen for hours. But in his closest relationship, he felt invisible. He'd say, when I share something difficult, the conversation pivots back to them within 2 sentences. So I just stopped. For 2 years, Marcus stayed, smiling at gatherings, showing up. Then one weekend, he simply didn't return home. No argument preceded it. When I later asked him why, he said, I realized I'd been talking to a wall for a decade. It wasn't that my love died. It's that I had to stop dying for it. That phrase cuts to the core. Sometimes we don't leave because we hate someone. We leave because staying demands we hate ourselves a little more each day. The silence becomes a final boundary, not built to hurt the other, but to preserve the last fragile embers of inner peace. But there is a dangerous misreading. From the outside, people accuse the one who left of being immature, of not communicating. Yet they rarely count the number of times that person did communicate, softly, desperately, over and over, only to be unheard. So the real question isn't why did they suddenly stop talking, but what did they try to say for years before the silence began? That reframe alone can dissolve bitterness and replace it with something more hauntingly human. Now, what's even more unsettling is that many who disappear this way wore a particular mask that made their suffering invisible, even to themselves. We'll uncover that mask in the next chapter, and you may recognize it in someone you know, or even in your own mirror. Chapter 3. The Mask of Perpetual Composure. Imagine a porcelain vase, beautifully painted from the outside, set on a shelf for years. To every eye it appears flawless, but inside, hairline cracks have been forming from repeated stress no one could see. One day, the slightest vibration, something trivial, shatters it. The bystanders are stunned. They say, "It was so strong, so lovely. Why would it break now?" They never saw the fractures. Jung called the persona the public mask we wear to meet the world. It's not inherently false. It's a social tool. The danger comes when a person identifies so completely with their mask that they lose contact with the living person behind it. And there is a specific mask many silent leavers carry. The mask of the one who is always fine, always gentle, always the caretaker of peace. This person learns early, perhaps from childhood, that their own pain makes others uncomfortable. They are rewarded for being low maintenance, for smiling through difficulty, for being the easy one. Over time they internalize, my worth depends on not being a burden. So they learn to swallow tears before they fall, to say it's okay before they've even registered the wound, to become an expert in appearing unshaken. And this performance is so convincing that even close ones believe it. They become, in Jung's terms, over-identified with a persona of goodness and stability, while their true feelings atrophy in the dark. Have you ever caught yourself responding, "I'm fine," when your insides were crumbling, and then felt a strange mixture of relief and loneliness that no one pushed further? That is the mask at work. Literature gives us a powerful mirror. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the protagonist descends into psychosis behind a veneer of obedient convalescence. Her husband and society see only a compliant woman, while her inner world shrieks for release. Or consider the modern archetype of the strong friend, the one who supports everyone, yet no one thinks to ask how they are truly doing. They become so polished, so agreeable, that they render themselves invisible. And one of the most tragic consequences is that the mask, worn long enough, begins to feel like the only face they have. They forget which emotions are genuinely theirs, and which are merely performed to maintain the peace. This isn't conscious deception, it's survival. But the psyche exacts a price. The energy required to constantly monitor and adjust one's outward expression drains the life force. Many people who later disappear from relationships report they felt entirely exhausted, not from conflicts, but from the relentless effort of appearing fine when they were not. And because no one saw through the performance, they concluded, often unconsciously, that no one truly wanted to see them anyway. So they left. At this point, the persona isn't just a mask, it's become a cage. And the step into silence is often the first taste of freedom the real self has had in years. It's messy, it's painful, but it's also the psyche's raw attempt to stop suffocating. Yet beneath that mask are wounds that were never spoken aloud, often the very reason the mask was built in the first place. In the next section, we'll go deeper into those invisible injuries, and you might begin to understand why healing isn't about forcing the wounds to close, but about finally giving them a voice. Chapter 4. Wounds that never found words. Some pains are so quiet, so private, that they don't fit the typical image of trauma. They rarely appear as screaming fights or dramatic breakdowns. Instead, they live in the small dismissals, the looks that say you're overreacting, the times when a person's most tender emotion was met with silence or minimization. Jung believed that what remains unspoken does not simply dissolve. It sinks into the unconscious and becomes a splinter in the psyche, an invisible shard that can dictate reactions for decades. I worked with a man named Daniel, who in his 40s found himself pulling away from everyone, co-workers, friends, even his children. No single event had triggered it, but as we traced back, Daniel uncovered a pattern from his youth. Whenever he had cried as a boy, his father would look away and say, "Stop being dramatic." His mother would offer a practical solution without ever acknowledging the feeling. So Daniel learned, with painful precision, that his sadness was unwelcome. He packed it away. By adulthood, he'd become the steady, reliable one, always joking, never showing strain. But the unwept tears hadn't gone anywhere. They had hardened into a silent conviction that no one could hold his pain. And so, to protect himself from the repetition of that rejection, he began preemptively leaving, emotionally first, then physically, before anyone could ignore him again. This is the architecture of an unspoken wound. It's not the event itself that does the most damage. It's the lingering message, your feelings don't matter. Repeated over years, that message becomes a foundational belief, and the person builds a life around avoiding further confirmation of it. They may seem independent, even aloof, but under the surface, they carry a grief that has never been witnessed. And the silent exit is often the final misguided attempt to escape that pain. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, not because suffering is purifying, but because the things we've buried must be felt again to be integrated. The problem is, many people have been so thoroughly conditioned to suppress that they honestly don't know they're wounded. They confuse numbness with resilience and detachment with growth. But the body and the unconscious keep score. Unexpressed hurt can manifest as a sudden aversion to intimacy, a chronic fatigue that doctors can't diagnose, or an urgent impulse to cut ties that seems to come from nowhere. When you find yourself wanting to withdraw, do you ever pause to ask, am I reacting to what's happening now, or to an old scar this moment has just touched? That single question can reveal that you're not being too sensitive. You're being reminded of a wound that was never allowed to speak. Now, what's crucial in Jung's view is that these wounds don't just hurt. They form the raw material of the shadow. When pain is denied, it joins the shadow, along with every impulse we've deemed unacceptable. And the shadow, when ignored, doesn't lie dormant forever. It begins to speak in a language of its own, often the very language of sudden disappearance. So let's step into that darker territory, where the shadow not only walks, but leads the entire dance. You'll discover how what you repress can eventually drive your most consequential decisions. Chapter 5. When the shadow takes the wheel. If the persona is the face we show the world, the shadow is everything we refuse to see in ourselves, the anger we won't admit, the jealousy we mask as politeness, the deep longing for love we're too proud to voice, and even the capacity for cruelty we'd rather not acknowledge. Jung insisted that the shadow isn't evil. It's simply the unconscious repository of all the parts we've disowned. And when we neglect it, it operates autonomously, like a hidden driver behind our actions. A classic literary illustration is Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jekyll is the respectable doctor, utterly identified with his goodness, while Hyde embodies the repressed desires and violence he could never consciously admit. The more Jekyll tried to suppress, the more powerful Hyde became, until the suppressed identity burst out unbidden. Human psychology works in a parallel way. Many people who vanish abruptly are not acting from clear conscious choice, but from a shadow that has gathered so much force it takes over. Think of the kind, accommodating person who one day just cuts everyone off without a word. Beneath that gentleness, decades of swallowed anger and unfought battles have been accumulating. The anger never got a seat at the table, so it carved its own door. The exit feels sudden to everyone else because they never saw the shadow building in the dark. But from the inside, it's an eruption of everything that was denied. I'm done being nice. I'm done explaining. I'm done staying in a place that starves me. The tragedy is that because this shadow carries all the blunt force of unstoried emotion, it often lacks nuance. It leaves no room for conversation, for closure, for the possibility of repair. The person vanishes behind the shadow's wings, and the conscious self is left picking up pieces later. Jung's antidote is not to destroy the shadow, but to make the darkness conscious. He said we don't become enlightened by imagining light figures, but by facing what we've hidden. So the real question for anyone who's felt the impulse to disappear, or for those trying to understand someone who did, is, what unacknowledged feelings were running the show? Was there a buried fury that couldn't find a clean channel? Was there a grief that was dismissed so often it mutated into cold withdrawal? Until we can answer that, we're only looking at the surface of the storm. To make this tangible, consider the metaphor of a pressure cooker. Imagine the psyche as a sealed pot on a stove. Every day you add a bit of hurt, a dash of resentment, a ladle of unmet longing. Then you seal the lid tighter, because you're afraid of what might boil over. The heat keeps rising. The cooker looks fine from the outside, but the internal pressure is immense. Then one minor incident, the equivalent of a tiny knock, releases the valve violently, spewing steam everywhere. The person who left did not decide to explode. The pressure accumulated over years did. And without a conscious relationship with the shadow, the release often takes the form of severing connection altogether. What emotions have you been stockpiling? Have you given yourself permission to feel anger without guilt? To admit jealousy without shame? To confess that you need to be seen as much as you see others? Because if you haven't, those feelings may be gathering in the dark, and one day they'll choose the exit for you. This is not to romanticize the shadow's takeover. It can create deep collateral pain. But recognizing its role changes the conversation from blame to understanding. The person who disappears might be, in a distorted way, trying to become whole by breaking free of unbearable fragmentation. The tragedy is that without consciousness, the freedom can be destructive. Yet there's a profound twist. Sometimes disappearing is the only way a person knows to protect a self that has been slowly eroded. That brings us to the deepest layer, leaving not to escape others, but to finally find oneself. Chapter 6. Vanishing to become whole. After all, could it be that some departures are not acts of giving up, but acts of urgent self-reclamation? When a person has been chipping away at their own truth for too long, swallowing their anger, minimizing their needs, performing a character instead of living, their psyche may signal that the only path to survival is to withdraw. This isn't about punishment or indifference. It's about a final desperate bid to preserve the authentic self before it's completely dissolved by an environment that cannot hold them. Jung called the journey toward wholeness individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, beyond the dictates of family, culture, and fear. And often, individuation demands that we step back from situations that shrink us. The lover who leaves after years of feeling unseen may be, on an unconscious level, choosing aliveness over a slow spiritual death. The friend who drifts away might be protecting a fragile inner flame that was being extinguished by dynamics they could no longer bear. The parent who steps back from adult children after endless belittlement might be reclaiming dignity. In each case, what looks like abandonment to the outsider can be, from the deepest perspective, an act of fidelity to the self. Imagine a wild bird that has been kept in a cage so long it forgets how to fly. The caretaker provides food, a clean perch, and praises the bird for its lovely song. But the bird's nature is to ride thermals, to migrate, to be wild. One day, the door is accidentally left ajar, and the bird flies away without a backward glance. The caretaker feels abandoned, asking, "Didn't I give it everything?" But the bird wasn't leaving a home. It was escaping a prison. For some people, the relationship, the role, the expectation becomes that cage. They leave not because they lack love, but because love without freedom eventually suffocates. This is where Jung's perspective becomes radically compassionate. He said wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integrating the contraries. In other words, you cannot become whole by endlessly suppressing your anger, your sadness, your limits. You must find a way to include them in your living. If a relationship consistently forces you to amputate parts of yourself, the psyche will at some point send a loud signal: leave. And that signal is not a failure of character. It's the instinct for wholeness asserting itself against fragmentation. Of course, this does not mean that every disappearance is enlightened. There is a world of difference between a conscious, communicated step back and a blind flight driven by shadow impulses. Maturity lies in recognizing one's limits early, voicing them clearly, and if needed, withdrawing with integrity, not with a punishing silence that wounds others. But the truth is, many people who vanish without explanation have never been taught, nor given permission, to state their needs directly. They've been shaped to be easy, and when the breaking point comes, the only tool left is to run. As we understand this, we can move from judgment to a more complex sorrow, for both the one who left and the one who stays. Perhaps the most important question to ask yourself is this: am I disappearing from my own life even while I stay? Am I so busy keeping the peace that I've stopped being a person? Sometimes the first step isn't to leave others, but to return to yourself while you're still here. Chapter 7. Where silence speaks loudest. We've traveled from the initial shock of an unexplained exit, down through the layers of accumulated exhaustion, the mask of composure, the buried wounds, the shadow's quiet guidance, and finally to the possibility that leaving can be a distorted call to wholeness. What emerges is a far more human picture than mere coldness. The silent departure isn't a simple act. It's a symptom of an inner world that has been starved of oxygen for too long. A psyche that could no longer bear to keep pretending. And perhaps the most sobering truth is that nobody can fully know the weight another soul is carrying. We see the surface. The depths belong to them alone. So before we condemn the one who left, we might pause to imagine the years of trying, the tears swallowed, the words that were never met. And before we blame ourselves for being left, we might recognize that sometimes the departure was never about our worth, but about the other person's exhaustion. That doesn't erase the pain, but it can soften the shame. If you have been the one to disappear, know that your silence may have been your psyche's language when speech failed. It doesn't make you a monster. It makes you terribly, beautifully human. And if you are still carrying the weight of that decision, perhaps the next step is not to judge yourself, but to finally give words to what you couldn't say then, whether in a journal, in therapy, or in a letter you never sent. The shadow that drove you away can become a teacher if you learn to listen. If you have been left behind, see if you can look past the sudden absence and into the quiet erosion that preceded it. Let it remind you to ask the people in your life now, are you truly okay? Not the fine you show, but the reality behind it. And let it be a call to become someone who is safe enough that truth doesn't have to hide. I'd like to end with a direct invitation. In the comments below, share a word or two that this video stirred in you. Maybe understood, maybe healing, maybe just I see it now. Or, if you've lived through a disappearance from either side, tell your story briefly. You never know who will read it and feel a little less alone in their own silence. If you found this journey meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to Shehzad Hussain so we can continue exploring the deep corners of human psychology together. Because in understanding the parts of ourselves that are hardest to look at, we stumble